Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2013 Theodore Fink Memorial Lecture to be delivered by Professor Raewyn Connell. My name is David Beckett and I'm the Deputy Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and the Dean, Field Rickards, sends an apology, he has another engagement tonight. As we begin, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land, and I pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation. It's wonderful to welcome you all here this evening. This is a particular delight because it's a large attendance and it's the first of several Dean's Lectures this year. They come thick and fast from now on. So next week, colleagues from the Peabody School of Education, Vanderbilt, and a week later, the Curry School in Virginia, and then in early September, Michael Scriven, Program Evaluator Extraordinaire and Polymath. And then there are three others closer to Christmas. So do keep an eye on the website. It's a very vibrant Dean's Lecture series underway tonight. It's terrific to welcome colleagues from other universities, from schools and from various other educational organisations, as well as people known to ourselves. You're invited to join Professor Connell after the lecture, around 7 o'clock, for light refreshments in the foyer, immediately outside the door there. So we won't have questions in the room, but you'll be able to talk to Raewyn afterwards. We need to just notice for a few moments some facts about Theodore Fink. Now there's a surname to conjure with. Theodore Fink was born in Guernsey, in the Channel Islands in 1855. His family migrated to Australia in 1861, and during the late 19th and into the 20th century, Theodore became a prominent Melbourne figure, a parliamentarian, a newspaper owner and journalist. A newspaper owner and journalist. We're living with that, aren't we? A lawyer, an entrepreneur, an investor who made and then lost money in the land boom of the 1880s and 90s. Fink was also a committed advocate of federation, a friend of Alfred Deakin, as well as of artists and writers, Marcus Clarke, Fred McCubbin, Arthur Streeton, and so on. He held strong opinions on the role of schools and the aims of education. In 1899, he was appointed chair of the Royal Commission on Technical Education, which initiated basic reforms to the provision and the length of secondary schooling in this state. Fink was committed to achieving greater recognition of the value of secondary technical education, but his educational interests ranged widely. In 1904, he was chair of the Royal Commission into the University of Melbourne. Yes. This can't be a good thing. The commission was established after the discovery in 1901 that the university accountant had embezzled a considerable sum of money. The commission went well for us, however. It investigated the university's teaching, administration and finances and ended up recommending that we offer new courses and an increase in the financial grant to the university. Those days are over. I was very fortunate to run across Raewyn's 2007 book, and as a philosopher I have dipped into it, and chapter 6 on Iranian social theorists resonates with me in particular. I'm not going to delay proceedings, but I do want to note the significance of it to me in an adjacent discipline. Very helpful. So we are honouring, in this series of Fink Lectures, eminent Australian educators. And we're able to do so because in this particular case, Theodore Fink's son and daughter made an endowment to the university after his death in 1942, and the nature of this lecture and all the other ones in the decade since 1942 have been concerned with historical or comparative studies of Australian education with this single purpose, the purpose of advancing education in Australia. So this is, of course, entirely relevant to tonight's topic, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Julie McLeod, to introduce Raewyn in more detail.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to see such a big audience tonight and some familiar faces. Professor Raewyn Connell, as many will know, is a university professor at the University of Sydney, based importantly in the Faculty of Education and Social Work. She is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia, a graduate of the Universities of Melbourne and Sydney. She was founding Professor of Sociology at Macquarie University, a visiting Professor of Australian Studies at Harvard, and Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is one of Australia's most eminent sociologists, internationally renowned for her groundbreaking work across several areas of fundamental importance to the study of education. These include gender relations, social class, inequalities in education, study of masculinities, and the social context and effects of theory. She has had a long engagement with educational research and practice, with the politics and possibilities of social change and the challenges of addressing the complexities of educational disadvantage. Indeed, her first piece of educational research, I suppose, and I may be corrected on this, was her PhD thesis on the development of children's political ideas, subsequently published as The Child's Construction of Politics. Since then, she has gone on to write 21 books, and her work has been translated into 16 languages. Her most recent books are Confronting Equality, Gender and World Perspective, and Southern Theory, which David showed. These books continue to inspire and provoke, engaging new generations of researchers, activists, and educators alike. My first encounter with Raewyn's work was through Making the Difference, with its yellowing pages and seriously annotated sides. A book that I read during my dip-ed, in the midst of reading all the other great sociological classics of the time, largely the European ones. It powerfully showed how gender and class relations were made and remade in Australian schools, that we did not need to look to the UK or Europe, to Chicago or Wolverhampton, to understand or make sense of these transformations. In this way, it prefigured for me some of the arguments elaborated in Southern Theory, pointing to those distinctive formations of inequality and difference and theory building that was happening in Australia. In later work with Lynn Yates, it was this book and Raewyn's other work was part of a background discussion in our thinking about a longitudinal study of young people. Now, many of us in this room tonight will have our own stories about which Connell book mattered and which arguments inspired us, annoyed us, prompted us to agree or disagree, to debate and, of course, to dispute. I'm sure tonight's lecture will be no different. And I'm delighted now to invite Professor Connell to present tonight's lecture entitled Test Rich, Just as Poor, Australian Education in the New Era. Thank you, Raewyn.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be here. As a graduate of both Melbourne and Sydney universities, I feel free to insult both impartially and will try to do so in the course of the lecture. I'm delighted to be back in Melbourne, especially to be welcomed by the magnificent sunset you turned on today. One of Melbourne does sunsets well, a point from which I draw no political implications, though I notice that Australian politics has returned to its normal setting of two authoritarian men facing off in Canberra. Well, the lecture is named for another political figure, as we've heard, Theodore Fink, an interesting character, member of the colonial intelligentsia in late 19th century Victoria and then early 20th century Australia. Someone who narrowly escaped bankruptcy as a result of his involvement in very dodgy deals in the Melbourne land boom of the 1880s, but went on to be a leading figure in the construction of the new political culture, winding up as chairman of the board of a leading newspaper, in which capacity, if I remember rightly, he gave the young Keith Murdoch a job, thus having a role in the foundation of our distinguished Murdoch media dynasty. Fink's story shows a very specific social role that education can be understood to have. That is, as an agent of social change and a force, a mechanism in nation building, very much the way that people concerned with public education in his generation tended to think. From other points of view, from less privileged points of view, education at the same time could have been seen as a ladder of social mobility, which it certainly was for some young working class people. It could also be seen as an arena of privilege and a form of social exclusion, which is also a way it functioned at the same time. Education is a large enough and complex enough social institution that it can be seen from different points of view and acquire different social functions, if you like, from the different points of view. And I will be trying to suggest in the course of this lecture some of the ways in which the social role of education has been constructed and how it's changed over the last generation or two. We are living in a society which is not the same as the society of North America or Europe, although they are our usual points of comparison and points of reference in education. We're living in a country which has the oldest, longest established, oldest continuously existing civilization in the world. We live in a country which, in historical terms, is fairly recently colonised, where the colonisation, the appropriation of Aboriginal land was a central process in the making of the new society, and where a settler colony society was created in the course of the 19th century, which then consolidated itself within the context of an increasingly global economy, a global state, the British Empire, which provided the framework of Australian politics and culture well into the 20th century. So I'll move on from Mr. Fink to the next significant politician in my story, Pig Iron Bob, famous for his loyalty to the British Empire, of course. When we were looking for pictures to illustrate this lecture, the ones that kept coming up were him wearing a kind of Admiral's hat as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. Those of you of my generation will remember our astonishment and laughter when he suddenly appeared as a late imperial dignitary after leaving his role as Prime Minister. But as Prime Minister, as the Conservative Prime Minister in the Cold War era of the 1950s, he was an important figure in the development of Australian education, though he probably had very few educational ideas in his own head ever. But that was the era when Australia began to shift from being simply a settler colony performing a colonial role within the imperial economy, that is sending raw materials back to imperial headquarters. The sheep's back story about Australian minerals, of course, were always important. But there was an important shift in his generation, attempting to make Australia a modern industrial economy. And Menzies was one of the people who provided the, if you like, political framework for what the economists call import replacement industrialisation, or import substitution industrialisation, IRI, in the jargon of development economics. This was a strategy of development for colonial economies, which was also adopted in South Africa, in Latin America. In fact, it was better theorised there than anywhere else, but it was also adopted in India to some extent. which attempted to build from a colonial economy, a colonial export economy, an industrial base, and thus provide the material infrastructure for a highly developed modern regime. So a crucial step in this was the formation of a steel industry in Australia. This is the BHP steelworks in Newcastle in the 1920s, which became, in fact, one of the more efficient steelworks in the world, I gather, and was central to the process of industrialisation of the Australian economy from the 1920s on through to the 1970s. Now, steel was a basis of it, but it also meant a broader spread of manufacturing activity and development, which I will summarise in one image. An publicity image from an institution that no longer exists. Does anyone recognise the airline? Okay, this is TAA, thank you. And the car, you will remember. And now, is this an FJ? I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's a little later than the FJ Holden, but these are icons of industrial development in Australia from the 1940s through to the 1960s and 70s. And of course, the modernisation process also involved the modernisation of the body and of fashion and of forms of femininity and masculinity, which are in some ways nicely summed up in the icon of the very modern air hostess, which I've been learning about from a lovely book called The Air Hostess's Shoe, which is a kind of social history of air hostesses in Australia. The modernisation, the industrialisation of the economy, the modernisation of the culture, partly a matter of American influence, but with a very large push from within Australia, both from Australian capitalists and from the working classes, in due course had its impact on education. Well, in fact, pretty early. So this is in the history of education, this is understood as a time of great institutional development. So the Australian education system expands massively from the 1940s to the 1970s and 80s. There's a threefold increase in the scale of secondary schooling and a fivefold increase in the scale of higher education in about 2.5 decades. This is a picture, I think a very beautiful picture actually, of a new high school being built in the suburban context. The combination of modernism and the Australian environment, I think, says a lot. And also, of course, the environmental devastation that's being caused in the foreground. Anyway, this is an example of what became the, if you like, the leading edge of Australian educational development in that generation. The co-educational, comprehensive community high school, the inclusive model of secondary education, which became the leading form of the organisation of secondary education in a period of enormous expansion. Now, that moment, I'm speaking in decades, of course, of development and expansion, did have its problems, and in due course it gave rise to serious analysis and critique. The expansion was partly due to demographic expansion, which was driven to a large extent by migration. Within the White Australia policy, migration from Europe substantially. But even so, that complicated the Britishness inherited from the era of dependency within the British Empire. and led to attempts to create multicultural policy, multicultural consciousness, and even to some extent to complicate the curriculum within the schools. This was a time of change in the gender division of labour, with a rising workforce participation by women, especially married women. That was the big demographic change in the workforce in this generation, rising the rise in married women's workforce participation. And this led to debates about the appropriate form of education for girls. And in 1975, to this report, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, and which I think is the first feminist education strategy at a national level anywhere in the world. Australia was cutting edge in terms of gender strategy in education in that generation. And also, of course, the expansion, although it gave enormous new educational opportunities to working class kids, it didn't eliminate class inequalities in educational outcome, in access to university education, or in access to the professions, which to which elite education was the functioned as doorkeeper. So this too led to investigation and critique and debate. One of the people who was centrally involved in that, and I think one of the great Australian educators, is Jean Blackburn, the sponsor of the Girls' School and Society report, and also deeply involved in the debates about social inequality and class in the context of the Carmel reports, which I'll speak about in a moment. And it was Jean, in part, who provided inspiration for this kind of research, which has already been mentioned, which tried to understand the mechanisms of social differentiation within the expanded and apparently democratic and common secondary education that had been produced. Now, educators in the systems were also involved in these debates. Jean, of course, had been a secondary school principal. Even administrators in this generation of the 1960s and 70s began thinking radical thoughts. 1970, for instance, is the date of one of the most remarkable documents in Australian education, the Freedom and Authority in Schools Memorandum, that was put out by Albie Jones, the then Director General of Education in the state of South Australia, which opened up the question of decentralising the famously monolithic state education departments, of devolving authority about curriculum testing, the shape of school relationships to principals, and then devolving that authority to teachers as the workforce of the school, and indeed even devolving some of it to students. This was a moment when a democratic agenda of a new kind really did arrive in Australian schools. And that was the context of the Carmel report in South Australia in 1969, if I remember right, 68, 69, which is a very impressive piece of social investigation of education, and the much more famous Carmel 2 schools in Australia that was sponsored by the Whitlam government, and which led to, among other things, the Disadvantaged Schools program and the large-scale state funding of church schools, whose ironic consequences we're grappling with today. Now, that, if you like, was the moment when the post-war boom, the import replacement industrialisation economic strategy and the social and educational changes that came with it began to be called in question, began to seem problematic. The mid-1970s saw hesitation in the world economy, the oil price shock, political change with the end of the rule of the coalition of the Menzies era, the short-lived Whitlam government, and then an increasing, if you like, social tension as a whole lot of new social movements, the women's movement, the gay movement, the land rights movement, began to kick in and question the social arrangements of the generations before. And it was in that context, in the early 1980s, with a new Labor government, that Peter Carmel was commissioned to write another report, one which is largely forgotten now, called Equality of Education in Australia, which came out in 1985. And in this, Carmel, who was an economist by trade, began to apply a new kind of economic language to the problems of Australian education, focused on outcomes, input and outcomes, attempting to measure outcomes of educational institutions' work and plug those into a kind of cost-benefit analysis, which had not been the principal way that education policy had been formed before then. Carmel, who was extremely well informed about education systems, was by no means blind to the issues of class inequality, gender inequality, and the other issues, Aboriginal education, questions of multiculturalism, the position of migrants in the system. Carmel was aware of all of these, but in the Quality of Education in Australia report in 1985, these issues were framed in a new way. The language is interesting. These issues are now talked about as the educational problems of special groups who need to be accounted for somehow, with the implication that beyond these special groups, and no one added up to find out how many they were, beyond these special groups, things were sort of okay for the broad majority of the community. That was 1985. It's an interesting document and an interesting moment. The next year, Paul Keating, the Treasurer, the young lad on the right, was being interviewed on the radio by one John Laws, who challenged him about his economic policy of deregulation, bargain with the unions, and orienting Australia more to the global economy. And Keating came out with a famous statement. If we don't have this sensible economic policy, he told John Laws on air, we will become a banana republic, a third-rate economy. And that was just a passing comment in a radio interview, but it stuck. And it stuck because it did actually encapsulate something very important that happened in the 1980s, which the rest of the lecture is going to be about the consequences of this repositioning, rethinking that, to my mind, is actually summed up by Keating, who had undoubted talent for telling phrases. This was the moment, and this is, bear in mind, Thatcher in England, Reagan in the United States, Kohl in Germany, But Labor in Australia and Labor in New Zealand were all turning in the same direction, but with rather different logic when it was a question of countries in the global periphery like Australia and New Zealand. This was the moment when neoliberal ideas really began to get a grip in Australian politics and policy making. The ideology of the market, the doctrine of deregulation, the attempt to shrink the public sector, shrink tax, the tax take, and liberate entrepreneurial energies. This is the ideology. Now, we tend to think of this as Thatcherism or Reaganism, or attribute it to the Chicago School. But this is where my Southern theory thinking really kicks in, because the first country actually to go neoliberal was in the far south. It was Chile. And the gentleman on the right is the one who made it happen, Augusto Pinochet, the military leader who became dictator in Chile after the military coup of 1973 that threw out the Unidad Popular socialist government. The gentleman on the left, the young gentleman on the left, are a group of young economists and entrepreneurs who then proceeded to reshape the Chilean economy. They were called by Santiago wits the Chicago Boys. But in fact, much of it was a policy that had been developing in Latin America in reaction against their import replacement industrialisation strategy. And Latin America, and specifically Chile, became the model for an economic transition that then spread increasingly around the world, and eventually was named the Washington Consensus, was taken on by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and became the economic orthodoxy of our day. Okay, we know this largely in terms of a focus on short-term profits, on deregulation of the economy, privatisation of public sector institutions like TAA and Qantas. But from the global south, from countries like Chile, New Zealand and Australia, the crucial thing was a repositioning in the global economy. No longer pursuing a strategy of industrial development, which would place us, if you like, on the same kind of footing as industrialised countries, but rather searching for what the economists call comparative advantage in a global market. What is it that we can sell into global markets cheaper than anyone else? Was the nature of the strategy. Well, that's what Australia had been doing in the 19th century, actually in Fink's generation, with wheat, with minerals and so forth. And lo and behold, we began to do it again. So this became the growth point of the Australian economy in the new neoliberal era, digging up coal and shipping it mainly to relatively newly industrialised or industrialising countries, digging up iron ore for the same kind of purpose, and renewing the export drive in primary industries. So that's basically that shift of strategy, which was also undertaken in Latin America and has been undertaken in South Africa since the end of the apartheid regime, is a typical response from a peripheral economy to the neoliberal logic of the market. It has many, many consequences which are still gradually being recognised in Australia. One is, of course, the decline of industry and industrial employment, which we're very conscious of in Australia, and the recent debates about the imminent end of car manufacturing is a very clear sign of that. But the consequences downstream are also important. So those consequences, that, by the way, is the best account of the advent of neoliberal ideas in Australia. It's, in fact, one of the earliest sociological studies of neoliberalism anywhere. Quite remarkable book. In education, the shifts are classically associated with someone who will be very familiar to you, John Dawkins, Minister of Education, Employment and Youth Affairs in the later Hawke government. But of course it wasn't only at federal level that this was happening. The Greiner government in New South Wales, the Kennett government in Victoria, and their analogues in other states have all been part of the shift of policy agendas which is involved. Now, I'm going to be very brief about what neoliberalism means in education. This is something I know many people in the room have been thinking about, but I'll just run through some of the classic features of neoliberal policy generally to note their educational consequences. The idea that services should be paid for by the user pays principle, in education has meant the introduction of fees in universities, the privatisation of some educational institutions, or the subsidy of private institutions on a fairly large scale, the turn of Australian universities to fee-paying overseas students is an important source of funding. And behind all of this, of course, if you like, a reclassification of education in the general imagination from the assumptions of Fink's generation, which were that education is basically a public good, something that the whole society needs to be done for our collective welfare, a rethinking of education as a private good, a private benefit to individuals or individual families, which needs then to be supplied through a market. So that's the first feature. Secondly, competition policy, which is quite institutionally powerful in Australia through the ACCC as one of our leading neoliberal institutions. In education, basically means regarding the school as a firm, treating the school as a firm, and then, or the university as a firm, competing against others within a market. Ultimately, this involves a form of policy thinking that treats the country as a firm, and you see that in OECD literature, for instance, where individual countries are set against each other in competitive contexts. And ultimately, even more ultimately, thinking of individual students as firms, because the neoliberal culture, if you like, tends to see everyone as an economic entrepreneur, as a profit-maximising firm in themselves. The third feature of the neoliberal revolution is the growth of managerial power, which we see both in the corporate economy and in what's left of the public sector. The rise of managerial salaries in the public sector is a striking indicator of this. In the education sectors, this means a redefinition of school principals, vice-chancellors and the like as entrepreneurs. It also involves, although this is not, I think, yet very well articulated in the literature, a new style of policy making, which I think of as policy making by coup, where policies, both at the institutional level and at the national level, are devised in private spaces within a managerial elite and then announced at a favourable moment if that's possible in the political process, and imposed on the other actors in the scene. This becomes the characteristic means of forming policy rather than the consultative grassroots up model of policy formation. Certainly the Labor Party once upon a time had, but hasn't had for a couple of decades. A fourth feature of neoliberal economics is restructuring of the workforce on a more market-oriented model. And this is certainly applied in education, most strikingly in TAFE, with the shift towards casualisation, deprofessionalisation, to some extent in universities where, according to some estimates, about half of undergraduate teaching is now done by casual workforce. And to a lesser extent, but probably increasing in the school sector too. And finally, there's a feature of neoliberalism which seems to be important and distinctive about education, and that is the impact of the market agenda on knowledge and the way knowledge is used by educational institutions. Firstly, the curriculum and the knowledge practices of schools and universities, although the market ideology is one of freedom and hence presumably diversity. In fact, the major effect of market forces is convergence on the market leader, not a growth of diversity. So we have a tendency to homogenise curricula, and that's actually been shown in some research on teacher education around the world in the last generation. It's something we can also see in textbooks. I think textbooks are a very interesting thing for educators to study as an object of knowledge. And the style of textbook publication now seems to me much more clearly oriented to the use of textbooks by a casualised workforce, by a casualised teaching force. So the textbooks now tend to, if you like, make it easy for someone who's not actually been able to prepare the course very well, nevertheless to produce a plausible teaching performance. But beyond that, shifts in knowledge, marginalisation of the social sciences, especially anything that looks like critical social science. It was interesting to hear one of the Republicans in the US Congress quite recently come out with the suggestion that the United States should defund all social science research and put all the money into medical, engineering and the hard sciences. So that's an area that is still not, I think, very clear what's happening in the realm of knowledge, but it strikes me as important, and we can at least see some of the shifts that are going on. Now, these kinds of changes have come in piecemeal. I mean, there's not a neoliberal headquarters somewhere back there designing all of this and implementing it step by step. It is an assemblage. It's an assemblage that takes different shapes in different countries, but it is powerful, and it's internationally now mutually supporting. Neoliberal economies and political orders in different parts of the world do tend to mesh and support each other. And it's not surprising, therefore, that these shifts in the state, in policy, in the culture, also shift social relations. There are new, if you like, new dynamics of social division emerging in this generation, which are also, I think, not extremely well understood, but we can perhaps get some bearings on them. And this is one of them. The demand to make all social services into commodities, to shape access through payment, to quasi-privatise public services and encourage consumers to pay. Well, what would make people pay for something that they have formerly had for free? Okay, what would make us pay for air? Well, perhaps if we were choking, if we were short of it. There needs to be, to drive a marketised education system, there needs to be a certain fear, a fear of failure. There need to be failures in order that people will pay to become successes. And this is one of the mechanisms. This is not My School, because they've stopped showing you this kind of thing on the My School website itself. They've got smart about it. But the media are still into this in a big way. The competition for test results, the competition for the best schools and so forth, is driven by the visibilisation, by the display of the failures, of the abject. And the league table has become the principal means by which need is created, by which demand is created in the education market. So there's been, in this generation, an amazing revival of educational testing, which just a generation ago was pretty much on the nose. There was a great deal of scepticism about IQ testing, abstracted achievement testing and so forth. It's all come back with a roar. Now global. I believe that the PISA now accounts for, the PISA system now covers something like 85 or 90% of the world's school population, in principle at any rate. And the competitive logic, the league table logic, is taken up and trumpeted by the mass media with considerable ease. And it's within that kind of context that you get the truly insane kind of policy statements, such as we recently heard from our national government, naming as the goal of Australian education policy to get Australia into the top 5 countries on the PISA tests. What kind of an educational goal is that, for heaven's sake? But within this policy world, within this cultural world, it makes a kind of sense. So that's one thing that's been going on, the production of a new pattern of social anxiety, new mechanisms of division and hierarchy. Now, the neoliberal policymakers are not stupid and they're not ignorant. They do know that there is such a thing as social inequality. They don't utter the word class, but they know there's something going on there. And so a form of neoliberal talk has arisen which talks about social inequality in education in another way. There's a classic example of it in this document that came out last year and which I encourage everyone to read. It's an appalling piece of social science, truly appalling, but it's very instructive, especially the chapter about education, which I think is chapter 6. If you want to see the future, here you are. And the way this report deals with social inequalities in education is to suggest that, we're all pretty comfortable. We're all, on much the same footing. We're, a pretty fair and just society. But there's a few, there's a minority. There's a small group of the disadvantaged or disorderly or insufficiently entrepreneurial down at the bottom somewhere who aren't doing well in educational competition and who need to be somehow retrained, reschooled and made properly entrepreneurial so that they can get into it and join with the rest of us in working smarter, and that's the final paragraph of the Australia in the Asian Century. We all need to work smarter in order to achieve prosperity and get lots and lots of profit back from the rising middle classes of Asia. It's an astonishing performance, but something that's well worth reading. It's there online, easy to access. And this is the Labor government. So when we get an Abbott government, it will be more of that and perhaps more intense. So what is, if you like, made invisible by this is the unequal investment in the education of different social groups, in the top-down curriculum that still characterises Australian education and is perhaps more firmly cemented in by the advent of the mass testing system, a policy process that's essentially impervious to the experience of the population and particularly to the workforce of the industries to whom the policies are applied. So effectively, teachers are not players in the educational policy process, collective in any collective sense anymore. And then, so that there's, if you like, the new mechanisms of hierarchy and anxiety making. There's the social exclusion model for disguising most of the reality of social inequality. But at the same time, there is an increasing concentration of wealth and advantage at the top of the social scale in Australia, as in most other countries since the neoliberal turn. This is a general consequence of neoliberal economies, that they tend to increase the Gini index. And so we get at the top of the system an unprecedented concentration of wealth in Australia. Okay, here are a couple of examples of that. A familiar face on the left, an even more familiar face on the right, the old and the new, if you like. This is the corporate version of it. This is the board of directors of BHP. BHP Billiton, as it's now called after the merger with the South African-based, and is now fundamentally a transnational corporation, though it pretends to call Australia home, and in fact is extracting huge profits from that minerals extraction process, which I talked about before. So a new generation of power holders in the corporate economy, and with them new kinds of public intellectuals who are increasingly, in a way that most visible intellectuals and academics in previous generations were not integrated into the world of corporate power and the culture of neoliberalism. So that's where we've got to. And I now have 5 minutes to get us out of it. So my final sections are the end of neoliberalism and the role of intellectuals in 5 minutes. Well, neoliberalism is not impervious. I mean, it's been going full blast now for 30 years or so, and undoubtedly has resilience and strength still. We're not at the point of exit from this world. But there are contradictions and difficulties within it. The relationship in Australia between the mining economy, the two-speed economy, the mining economy and the manufacturing industries is one example of that. Another problem is the way neoliberalism, in its attempt to create markets where markets did not exist before and privatise public sector institutions, has in effect been hollowing out the public institutions that were created in previous generations. And I think schools and especially universities are a very interesting example of that. The way the marketisation of Australian universities has actually been changing the culture or adding something to our contemporary universities, which is in serious tension with the academic culture that existed before. So when I look, and this is where I'll insult my own university now, when I look at the website of Sydney University, I have to say, more than anything else, it looks like a holiday resort. It doesn't look like a place where people suffer for knowledge. It's happy, smiling people, maybe with a few laptops scattered around as they recline decoratively on the lawns. But there's not much hard-edged intellectual culture visible in the public face of the market-oriented university. Maybe a few breakthroughs to show that we are really, well up the ladder. But that's about as much as it gets. So there's a kind of pretty much systematic lying about what universities are like that goes on in the PR operations of our universities, which is in considerable tension with the academic culture and the fundamental tasks of pursuing truth and disseminating learning. I'm reminded when I think about this of a famous poem written by Robert Browning, The Lost Leader, where he talks about the great poet of the English Romantic movement, William Wordsworth. And among other things, he comes out with the immortal line, "Two voices are there. One is of the deep, and one is of an old half-witted sheep, and Wordsworth, both are thine." And it strikes me that Australian universities are now speaking in two voices. And I don't know that it's an old half-witted sheep, but it's rather newer than that. But there is a very serious gap between the two voices with which Australian universities are speaking. And that's something our university managers are not confronting, are not actually dealing with. But others are. So that's what's going on at Sydney University at the moment. We're in the middle of an industrial dispute. We've had 5 days of strike. This is a march towards the administration on one of the days of protest. And our fearless branch president in the middle there, I'm glad to say. And many of you will have seen, but those of you who haven't, one of the consequences of the industrial struggle at Sydney has been a fascinating publication of letters to the Vice-Chancellor and letters to the Provost from members of staff from different parts of the university, some academic staff, some general staff. This is just some of them. There's now, I think, 10. You can access them through the NTEU, National Tertiary Education Union website. If you Google NTEU, you will come to it. And you go to University of Sydney branch website, scroll down, and you'll find the open letters, the links to all the open letters. And they are among the most interesting documents about Australian education generally, let alone Australian education, higher education in recent years. I very much encourage you to read them. So there is a kind of contestation going on, which is asking questions about how universities can function as democratic institutions nowadays in contemporary conditions. And that is, I think, part of what we have to do much more widely across the education system. We now have to think, in these new conditions, how do we make a democratic agenda in educational institutions? How can we have test-free classrooms in the era of my school? But we need them. How do we get an educational guarantee for people on whom much less than is spent, on whose education much less is spent than on the education of privileged kids. How do we get the democratic process within institutions, within educational institutions, to work in the teeth of the new managerialism? How do we get an inclusive knowledge agenda rather than a market-driven convergence on the market leaders through the massive online or open enrolment courses and so forth? Those are the questions we're facing now. I find them difficult questions, without the slightest doubt. I don't think we are yet very far in answering those questions, but those are the questions we really have to answer, as well as confronting the consequences of new technology, the online world, how we get a democratic online world, how we construct educational agendas from the new knowledge about embodiment and the new politics of bodies. There are really a lot of, this is in a kind of difficult way, this is a very exciting time to be involved in education. And in a way, a lot of dire things have been happening to the Australian education system, but at the same time there's a tremendous range of opportunities for new initiatives and new thinking and a desperate need for it. So let me encourage everyone here, of whatever generation, but of course especially the young people, to think of the role that intellectuals can play in social change. We've seen some of that from the other side with the organic intellectuals of the neoliberal movement, the new kinds of intellectual agendas that have surrounded the work of the OECD, kind of global think tank for neoliberal policy. In Australia, the new role that's been taken by the ACER, not just in supporting the testing needs of systems, but actually coming out in front as promoter of neoliberal perspectives in education. Those kinds of, that kind of work by intellectuals who've contributed to the neoliberal movement themselves, I think, open possibilities for critique and suggest the possibility of other kinds of intellectual work. Now, we do have a great tradition in education of critical thinking, of concern for inclusive and democratic education. And I'm not just thinking, just going back one generation here, but I think it's worth recalling some, if you like, of the deep formative classics of educational thinking, such as those of Jan Komensky, better known in the English-speaking world as Comenius, one of the people who conceived the idea of an inclusive public education system. We have many models of how in education we can speak truth to power, say the uncomfortable things, provide ideas that are useful to teachers, that speak to teachers' meta-competencies, not just the technical competencies in the classroom, but teachers' capacity for imagination, to relate the different kinds of competencies and possibilities that teachers have. And above all, the capacity of intellectuals in education to think dangerous thoughts. That's very much needed these days. So let me finish on that note and encourage everyone here not only to have dangerous thoughts, but to get them out there in the public arena and start and continue the battle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raewyn, for giving us a longer and a broader account to broach some of these dangerous questions and to keep working with them. A small gift to thank you. Yes. And I'd like to invite you all to join us for drinks and refreshments just immediately outside, and we'll thank Raywin one more time. Thanks.